What's up, storytellers? As we continue our series where we go beyond technique to figure out how to write better stories, we wanted to take a look at the concept of hope. What is it? Why do stories rely on it? And why do we tell those stories? Those are all pretty good, interesting questions about hope. That's what we're covering on today's show. I'm Jay Sherer, co-author of the full cast audio book, Death of a Bounty Hunter. We're in final production now, so I can't wait to release it to you guys. And joining me today is Caleb Monroe. I'll add him to the stream here. What's up, Caleb? How you doing?
Good.
And Caleb is a comic book writer, a screenwriter, and one of the deepest thinkers about storytelling that I know. But you would know that if you've been following our live series, because he has been all about that. He's also on the Reclamation Society's Storytelling Brain Trust and will be writing a short film for us for YouTube, hopefully soon. COVID has slowed a little bit of that stuff down, but we're still pushing forward on some of that. So how is this Friday for you, Caleb? You doing good this Friday?
I'm doing good this Friday. I'm in a different location, traveling, visiting some friends, birthday party. So doing well.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's always good to be able to get out a little bit when and see your friends, because it's very crazy to be cooped up at home this whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we are going to, again, get very deep and introspective about the concept of storytelling. And like I said, we're focusing on hope today. It's all about hope today. We do want you, this is a live show, so you can be in the comments. I've got a comment on YouTube from Robin. So Robin, hello. It looks like Robin is a Monroe. So that looks like you might know Robin, Caleb.
Yes, I do.
Perfect. Well, before we jump into this discussion about hope, let me read Google's definition of hope. And you can open any dictionary and find whatever it says. But this is what Google says. It says a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen, a feeling of trust, and then wanting something to happen or to be the case. So let me ask you this, Caleb. Does every story rely on hope in some way, shape, or form? Or do certain stories have hope and other stories don't have hope?
I will give you my favorite definition of hope.
Oh, okay. Let's hear it.
And then I will answer that question. My favorite definition of hope comes from philosopher James K.A. Smith. And he describes it as imagining otherwise. And so I would say that there can be stories without hope. I mentioned this, I think, in our conversation back in the spring. Something that the artist Eric Fischel said in an interview back in the 90s that really stuck with me. But he talked about the traditional roles of the artist are to portray paradise, the fall, heaven, and hell. Ooh. And the way that I read that is what's right with the world, what's wrong with the world, how things can get worse, and how things can get better. And I would say all of those are spaces for hope, except for the how things can get worse.
Yeah,
by definition. So most stories hope will play a significant role. Yeah. But there's a space, particularly in cautionary tales, for there to be no hope.
Well, first of all, you can always guarantee that Caleb will be super well read. That is a guarantee if you're listening to Caleb talk on a podcast. And I think you're right on. I love those categories. Can you say those categories one more time?
Yes. What's right with the world? What's wrong with the world? How things can get better and how things can get worse.
Yes. Perfect. And it's so funny because like last show we did, so this is going to be every 2 weeks, every other Friday basically. So 2 weeks ago when we did our show on beyond the technique of storytelling, I was going to answer this question as like, some stories don't rely on hope, but I still feel like even in the stories about how something can get worse, some of the characters still have hopes that it won't, right? Like there's always some character that has some sort of hope that things are going to get better in some way, even if the progression of the story is telling them that it's only getting way worse. And a lot of that came from prompting on what you said last time in the last show about desire. And all characters have some sort of desire. A lot of characters have the desire that things would get better. Some of the characters in the story for sure have that, hopefully. and desire being this driving force. So if I was started to think about it, reflecting on our last conversation, as desire is a driving force, and the end result of that driving force, the picture in their mind, is what hope would look like, right? And I think that that's really interesting. Like hope is sort of like an underlying vision of what could be in the future. So not all stories are hopeful, just based on your definition. That's obvious, right? Like very, very obvious. But all stories do seem to contain hope in some way, even if the ultimate goal of the story is to show like the opposite of hope or despair in some way or something along those lines. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. Like even audiences that are viewing or reading or engaging in the work of the artist in some way, even they put hope into the movie, right? Like or the TV show or the book. Like, they will bring their own emotions into that. So it's interesting. I do think that there are. Let me run this by you because I want to get your feedback on this too. I think that hope is such a complex topic because it's so layered of a topic. In other words, you've got basic needs and our hope for basic needs like food and shelter. We have hope for psychological needs, like we want love and affection. We have local and globally focused hope about safety, protection, community. We have philosophical and spiritual needs that relate to hope as we talk about meaning and purpose and even post-life or afterlife meaning, right? Like all of these things. So what do you, when you think about hope and you talk about those 4 categories that you gave us, how is hope layered in your mind? Are there multiple layers of hope, or is it all sort of related to the same thing?
I think hope is the same, but I think that there are degrees of it.
I like that.
Just sort of like last time when we were talking about that every story is going to involve a question, but some of those are going to be deeper questions than others. And some are going to lead you to a sitcom episode, and then some are going to lead you to something that haunts you for a movie that haunts you for years. And I think hope is that way too. And I think that hope is proportionately related to the darkness in a story. So you hit on something a minute ago that I was hoping to bring up today, and that is that I consider tragedy a function of hope. Because a story is a tragedy when it violates your audience's hopes. And it's a violation of hope, but because the audience has hope, that is why it's tragic. Otherwise, it would just be an ending. What makes it a tragic ending is that we want hope, desire, and even think there should be a different way that it goes. And so that makes it tragedy. Hope is closely related to, hope is not optimism. And to clarify what I mean by that, hope involves lament. That I'm hoping for something because I'm not seeing it. And so I'm also lamenting that this thing I'm hoping for is not here. And that can take a lot of different forms. But Smith, whose definition I quoted earlier, he talks about lament as sort of just naming something as an eruption of the cosmos, as an interruption of the cosmos, that it feels wrong. And by hoping for something different, we're also commenting this isn't right. And so it has a moral component. Hope is a should and not a could. It's not this could happen or this could happen. It's this should happen. And that's why I hope for it. And that's why it's so tragic when that doesn't happen. Like I said earlier, hope is this imagining otherwise, but it's an otherwise that fulfills our longings. So going back to what you were saying, hope is a type of desire. We're talking about being creatures of desire, and hope is one of those desires. It's a very strong desire. It's a longing for an otherwise than what is in front of us, because there's something that we're lamenting what's in front of us. You can't have hope without lament. If you have hope without lament, then what you get is optimism. So Terry Eagleton, in his book Hope Without Optimism, has a great quote. He says, "Optimists are as bereft of hope as nihilists because they have no need of it."
Oh, wow.
So if you just think everything is great, you don't need hope.
Right.
And he goes on to say that, whatever the professed political standpoint, someone who is an optimist is conservative because their faith in a benign future is rooted in their trust in the essential soundness of the present. Hope, on the other hand, points out that there are things unsound in the present. And that is why we are desiring another outcome. That's why we are desiring a difference. And so tragedy is a function of hope. This is not how it should go. And that's why the end of Hamlet or the end of Romeo and Juliet still bothers me every time. I know where the story's going, but every time it cuts like a knife, because it just shouldn't have, it shouldn't have been.
Right.
And it's not just tragedy. Blues takes on this, blues.
Yeah.
Lament is actually a form of poetry, stepping aside from the act of just sort of decrying something or wishing otherwise. Lament as poetry. Horror, I think we talked about this back in the spring. It all falls into this category of there's something wrong now. There's something amiss. There's been an interruption in the cosmos. And so what I'm hoping for is for something otherwise than what's happening. And so just to do one final quote from Smith. And I'm quoting because it's an essay called The Art of Hope, which I love by him. And I went back and reread it before we talked.
Perfect.
So one final quote from Smith. He says that art that inhabits oh my word, there's something wrong with words there. Art that inhabits the tension of lament and hope doesn't just communicate the message, but it actually does what it's talking about. Because when you convey lament in an artful manner, you are actually making the world a little bit better. You're taking something horrible and you're turning it into something that contributes toward the future that you want. It makes the world a little bit otherwise. So an art of lament and an art where lament and hope meet is actually accomplishing the very thing that it's longing for.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways that I think about this is in the Jewish Bible, or the Old Testament, there are women who are professional mourners. That like when someone dies, there were women in the town who would come and wail and mourn that person's death. And you see they come up several times throughout many different books in the Jewish scriptures. And what's very interesting is that the verb that is used to describe what they do is the same verb that's used to describe artists and craftsmen.
Oh, no way.
So their mourning is described as an art form. And I think that there's I think that's a wonderful way of sort of picturing or a door into understanding this connection between hope and lament, and that you can't have hope without lament. Otherwise it's optimism. And the two are twins.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I love that. I love that conversation piece. Just a couple comments I want to pick up on really quick. Robin said, maybe it's like needing light when it is totally dark. And that's very similar to what you're saying. Like you have to have the lament of the darkness in order to seek the light or to hope for the light. I like that a lot. I know I'm paraphrasing what you said and I'm butchering it, but still. Also, Cherie says, wow, there are things unsound in the present. That's cool. And I think this is why I was mentioning earlier that all writers, all creatives, when you're talking about story, will have to be inclusive of hope in some way, shape, or form, because it's almost like you can't have conflict without somebody hoping for something different, right? Like we don't have a desire unless we're hoping for something different to occur, and therefore a conflict will come about, whether we want something that's better, like the Avengers want something that's better for the universe, or whether we're like Thanos and we think that our definition of better is actually something far worse. We have a hope that something that it would all look different. So even villains, or like to your point about even horror, has the hope of some people who may have a very wrong sense of what hope should look like, right? I think a lot of us you're using scripture as an example, so I will too. But the concept of the word of shalom and the everything is as it should be, right? Well, stories are basically everything is not as it should be, and how do we figure out how to get it back to some sense of shalom? I think that's a really cool thing for people like you and me, people who are working on stories, to contend with. Is a really cool thing. So what are some examples? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, that ties into last week when we were talking about that, people have about 1,000 daydreams a day, very brief, just a few seconds, and dream many times during the night, but that almost all of them have this universal structure, which is there is a problem that someone is trying to solve. So whether that's rehearsing what you're going to say before you walk into a meeting, or whether that's something that's happening to you in a dream, stories have this just intrinsic DNA of there's a problem someone is trying to solve, and that right there puts us in the realm of hope and lament, because a problem means there's something unsound now, there's something that that should not be, and hope is the idea that it can be solved. Because the opposite of hope is despair, and that's when oh no, this can't be solved. And what's interesting is we think about despair as sort of an emotion on its own, or maybe like the extreme version of sadness. But I think despair is actually a type of pride, because what we're essentially saying is, I can't see a way that things can improve, therefore they must not be able to improve. And so despair is a type of pride and the opposite of hope. And it's this idea that things can't get better. And if you have despair, you don't have a story, because the character doesn't try to solve the problem.
Oh, that's really good. I actually think the next topic we might talk through is despair. maybe 2 Fridays from now we'll be talking about despair. What are some examples in your mind? I mean, we've talked about how hope shows up in a lot of different stories in a lot of different ways, even if it's just the audience reacting to it. Though, like you said, in the 4 categories, hope is not intrinsically the end result of any of those stories, right? Like there can be different end results. What are some examples in your mind of what you would consider to be hopeful stories?
Let's see. Well, the first 2 things that pop into my mind are The Fountain and First Reformed.
Okay.
I'm sure that there are many others, and if I thought about it, but those 2 popped to my mind. The final image of The Fountain has just always stuck with me. It's a movie about suffering and struggle throughout time, throughout all of history.
Oh wow!
But it ends in a very beautiful way. And First Reformed, what I particularly liked about First Reformed is that the ending is a little unclear.
Oh.
And so everyone I talk to has a slightly different interpretation of the ending, and their interpretation of the ending really tells you a lot about what their hopes are.
Interesting.
In this world, and what they, because I don't want to spoil anything. It's such a good movie. It's one of the best movies I've seen in a long time. Go see First Reformed. But because the ending is a little bit unclear, I think it actually ends up becoming a space for the operation of hope. It's a space where it's not clear cut as in the thing hoped for happened, but it's also not clear cut as in this is a tragedy. The thing hoped for did not happen. It is here is this space, and now interpret it. How much lament do you think there is in it, and how much hope?
I love that. That's cool. I'm gonna have to watch that movie because I have not seen that yet. So that's like a must watch for me. I have several examples to run by you too, and mine are all going to come from the geek world, science fiction, fantasy, and comic books, just because that's the world that I've lived in for so long with the podcast that I do called the Story Geeks Podcast. I think just about every Pixar movie deals with hope in some way, but I want to point to two, especially one of them. Inside Out, to me, deals a lot with hope, because one of the things I found fascinating about that film is that Riley's emotional health during the change that she's experienced is either being guided by hope or despair at any point in time, right? And some of the problems that she's facing are not necessarily of her own. She didn't create them herself. They have been thrust upon her because she's in a lot of change. And it occurs to me that hope and despair are sort of this like teeter-totter foundation of how her emotions show up to the control panel. So sadness can show up and be very healthy, and sadness can show up and be the foundation of lament that you're talking about, whereupon you build hope. But sadness can also show up in a really unhealthy way, where you just slip into despair and you just wallow in that despair and don't even see any sign of hope or an ability to get back to some semblance of shalom or the world as it should be. So I think that they don't talk about hope I don't think in the entire movie, but it was very instructive to me to watch a Pixar film, which is for families, to deal with situations and emotions that have this underpinnings that are really foundational to your understanding of how will things improve in my life or how will things get worse in my life, and which lens am I viewing life through. I thought that was really, really fascinating. The other Pixar film I wanted to throw out there is Coco, because it's about a kid learning to find hope despite the fact that he even knows that life will end and that family relationships will end. And he's like trying to find hope beyond those constraints. So I think that that's a really, really cool one too. And then I'm just going to throw out several others that I'm not going to get deeper into, but I love your response to them. Mm-hmm. Any of those that make sense for you to respond to. Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, to me is super hopeful. We did a podcast about that with Andrew Peterson, who is a singer-songwriter. And he was talking about this concept of eucatastrophe and the fact that human beings can't always solve the problems, and we need some external force to kind of right the world for us. And that's exemplified, of course, by Frodo not being able to throw the ring into Mount Doom, but it's still working out in the end. Which I want to talk to you about some other time, because there's also some parts of storytelling where we're like, no, we want to be able to do those things. So it's kind of fascinating to me. But also, I mean, any of the MCU films, any of the Star Wars films, all of those films kind of have this semblance of like, well, we want good to win out, and the problem that we're experiencing is a pretty significant one. So any of those stand out to you as being particularly guiding in terms of hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the MCU and superhero films are really more they're more like puzzle solving, I think than a great framework to aim hope on. I think in those movies the characters hope more than we do.
That's a good point. I think you're right. Yeah,
because they are hoping to fix the world, but we know they're going to. Right. So it it's a different, especially anything that's an ongoing series. You know that there's going to be a certain conclusion, and or certain types of genres. We talked before about romance. The two people will end up together. Yeah. And that is okay too, because knowing where it's going but not knowing the journey is still incredibly engaging for an audience. But so for the Marvel movies, I think we hope more. I mean, the characters hope more than we do. Lord of the Rings, I think, is a great example, and that word eucatastrophe was created by Tolkien, talking in his essay on fairy stories, where he talked about his approach to writing fantasy, which is, just to bring it all back, it was reading on fairy stories. Tolkien doesn't say this, but it was on reading it that I reached my conclusion that tragedy is a side effect of hope. Because he starts talking about some of those meta story things. And he talks about tragedy as the highest form of drama, and eucatastrophe is the highest form of fairy tale.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that because tragedies are some of my favorites. So so I think Lord of the Rings is a really, really, really good example. Justin Weaver, who's one of the Story Geeks hosts, actually co-host of the Story Geeks, he says Pixar's Up asks hope and despair questions too, like how can life continue and even get bigger after tremendous loss, referring to Carl's wife passing and Russell's absent father, which is that's a really good example. Pixar is an exemplary storytelling force in the world these days. So I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
The first is, so the last question is going to be how we include it in our writing and how we go about having hope inclusive in our writing. And one of the things that I'm going to come back, remind me that I have an example for that, and it's actually a romance, because I think that La La Land gives us a really fascinating, fantastic example of what you just said about we know a romance is going to end a certain way. And I want to talk about that because I think that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
But before we get there, before we jump into that, why do we even tell stories that are so inclusive of hope? Why is that? We've already talked about how it's just sort of a natural occurrence because of conflict and because of desire. But why do we do this? What's the deeper meaning that we tell these stories?
So I think that so hope is a side effect of being a creature of desire, because it's desiring a better outcome or a different outcome than what we're observing. But being creatures of desire, behind that is being creatures of imagination.
Oh, yeah.
Because to desire something means you can imagine a different version. If you're hungry, you have to imagine what it's like to be fed to desire food. If you're, you can use any example. So imagination is where desire is born, and hope is a type of desire. And so this is very relevant because we're talking about storytelling, which is a very intentional imaginative act. But I think we also have to remember that reading is an imaginative act, and so is pretty much most of being a human. Daydreams and dreams, all those things we were talking about, which take up hours of our day.
Right.
Those are imaginative acts, but it goes even beyond that. And so I'm going to, for those who may not have heard last week, I work at a church, so I have theological underpinnings from some of my thinking, but I'm going to refer to scripture here. But before I do that, I'm going to be talking about the story of the creation of humanity at the beginning of Genesis. Nice. But before I do that, understanding that there are probably people watching who don't, who consider that a parable.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I think that that's perfectly fine. I think what's interesting to me about parables as a storytelling form is that to get the meaning out of them, you have to imagine that they're true. You have to treat them as true to understand what they're saying. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, if you don't treat that as the actual story of someone who is left for dead, ignored by the rich and religious elites, and then saved and healed by someone from a despised socio-ethnic group, right, then you miss the meaning of the story. Because Jesus is using that story to talk about what does it mean to be a neighbor. And he's saying, well, this despised person, if they act this way, is a neighbor. And these revered people, if they act this way, are not. And so you have to treat it as a true story to get the meaning out of it. Yeah. So I'm gonna talk about Genesis and Eden and Adam and Eve and all of that sort of stuff. But I would just put forth that either way, whether you think it's parable, whether you think it's literal, whether you think it's a combination of the two, the way to get the meaning out of it is just to treat it as literal. And so as the best-selling book of all time, there's obviously something in there that resonates with people. Right. So it's worth going to this story to think about some of these things, these big things behind the things. So very shortly after the Bible begins, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then you get down, and on 26 verses later, God creates people.
Right.
It says, and what's really interesting about that is that God creates people in God's image.
Right.
And so you're only 26 verses into the story, but you're being told these things are made like this thing.
Mm.
So then what do you know about this thing?
Mm.
What do we know about God at that point? So what is our initial understanding of image of God supposed to even mean?
Mm.
You know, because we're reading this first,
Right.
theoretically. And at that point, we know three things about God in this story. And that is that God is creative, because we're in the middle of the creation narrative.
Right.
That God is relational. And this comes out a couple ways. For one thing, God says, let us make humanity in our image. But beyond that, there's the fact that it takes two humans, male and female, to reflect the image. Because the way the verse goes is that male and female, plural, were made in the image, singular. So
right.
it takes actual relationship to reflect that image. So in this story, what we know so far is that God is creative, God is relational, and that God is a storyteller, because the premise is that God is telling this story.
Right.
God was the only person there. So, and I think that you see those things universally in humans, that we are creative, that we are relational, and that we are storytelling. And we've talked a lot about storytelling in particular on this show. But what's interesting to me about all of that is behind all of those is imaginative. To create, you have to imagine something that hasn't been made yet, or that is different than what is around you. Imagination is the engine of relationship. Without imagination, there's no empathy, because empathy is largely an imaginative act of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And even beyond that, in the book Sapiens, the author's name is totally escaping me. I am so sorry. Author of Sapiens, I'm so sorry that your name has escaped me. But the book Sapiens, is a huge hit, sort of the history of humanity, written a while back. And he points out something very interesting about how were a lot of animals, and are a lot of animals on Earth. And there are social animals on Earth, and there are cooperative animals on Earth. But then almost all of those, that pretty much all those systems involve every individual knowing every other individual in the cooperative. That part of what made humanity unique is the ability to picture themselves as part of something much bigger than themselves. This is the only way you can get nations or cities. Someone had to be able to imagine that this person that they've never met, that's 1,000 miles away, is the king, and that they are part of the kingdom, and all the other people who they haven't met, that's an act of imagination, that society is an act of imagination. It's us being able to picture being a part of things that we have not experienced directly.
Yeah.
And so relationship is a very imaginative act. And then finally, storytelling, of course, is an imaginative act. And this is why, this is going to sound silly, but this is why I feel so strongly against parents who don't want to tell their kids about Santa Claus, or don't want their kids to believe in Santa Claus, because I think it's basically an imagination growing exercise. It's the ability to imagine this thing. And a lot of parents, for very good hearted reasons, they want to keep their children grounded in the reality, or they don't want them to feel deceived, or they don't want them to feel lied to, so they want to keep it real, for lack of a better term. But the problem is, if all you do is interact with the things as they are, and not things that could be or should be, you end up with a small imagination.
Right.
And we all know someone with a small imagination. Their life has shrunk to the boundaries of their own existence. It's an anti-empathy, and it's another way of thinking about it, Zadie Smith, in one of her essays, an essay that she wrote, I can't remember the title, but she was talking about the science fiction of J.G. Ballard and her experience reading it. And she describes it as the pornographic impulse, which is not, she's not talking about sexual pornography, although that is an example of it, but she's talking about this mindset of how everything that you encounter can serve you, can do something for you. And when you're anti-empathetic and the boundaries of your imagination have shrunk to your own existence, then everything serves that existence and nothing else. So you have become an embodied pornographic impulse. And so it's, Santa Claus is not the hill to grow or die on, but it's a symptom of of wanting imagination to be smaller, or not wanting them to get their hopes up, or not wanting them to, talking about hope. And so that it ends up becoming this utilitarian sort of life pornography, reduces the ability to hope, and we just become focused on ourselves. So I think imagination and storytelling are crucial to the goodness of our existence. And so creativity, relationship, and storytelling, behind all of those is imagination. And the creativity in particular is this idea of picturing something as it not is, the imagining otherwise that we've been talking about. And desire is a type of that, and hope is a type of that.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. And my friends are gonna laugh because I can't stand Santa Claus, but your point is perfect. So I'm not going to deconstruct the point, because the point is amazing. It doesn't have to be that particular example. Any form of imagination. Yeah. Totally. I want to tell you something specific too. As you use an example from the Bible, I want to give you actually an example of exactly what you're talking about what our interpretation of the stories are and how that's the important part. And in just a second, but first, let me get to another comment. Robin says, yes, creating stories and art is a way of trying to control the not right stuff in the world. If we invent the story, we have the control, even if the ending is tragic. And that's so true. And that's what a lot of what we talked about a couple weeks ago. Our ability to work through problems by engaging in conflict with our imaginations, right? And then some of us take those things and put them on paper or put them in film, and then we have stories.
And that has become a huge theme in Quentin Tarantino's filmmaking. Inglourious Bastards and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood are both examples of going back to make right the thing that was not right. And you can do it in the film. You can't, you can't do it in real life. You can't fix history. But in the movies, he is going back and making something that was wrong right.
Yep.
And I remember halfway through Inglourious Bastards, when I started to suspect that it was going to veer from history and end in a different way, I just remember thinking, that's brilliant. And so I'd say those are actually both really great examples of hopeful movies. I totally cried at the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because that's how it should have gone.
Yeah.
That's how it should have happened.
Yeah. Those are really fun movies. So let me give you the opposite of when we don't see wisdom in stories, right? So I'm listening to a Joe Rogan podcast where he is talking to another young comic. And I love the Joe Rogan podcast, so I listen to it a lot because it's a lot of the modern thinkers he has on to discuss different topics. But this is just another comic, and they were talking about cultural Christianity, and the guest says to Joe Rogan, or I don't know if Joe brought it up, or one of them brings up the story of Jonah, and one of them says, well, that he was, Job. They bring up the story of Job, and they say Job was in the belly of a whale for 40 days and 40 nights. And now, this is what's really fascinating to me about this, about what you said in the analysis of stories with the intent to find wisdom in them. If we look at the story just based on the facts, we could do two things. One, we could criticize their discussion about it because they got the facts all wrong, right? Like Jonah was Jonah was in the belly of a whale for 3 days or 3 nights or whatever the exact term was. But the really sad part about that discussion is that they were trying to prove or disprove the hypothesis that the story that occurs in the scripture was either true or not true. The problem with that is that both of those stories, whether you take Job or Jonah, are entirely instructive and super meaningful, regardless of the details about how they unfold. Now, the details matter, but what I mean is, if you take the story of Jonah is about the judgment that we have that people should not be allowed to be forgiven, and the grace of God to say, no, Jonah, you need to go tell those people that are offensive to you that I will forgive them if they repent. And Jonah saying, I don't want to do it, right? Like there's so much meaning and purpose in that story that is so instructive to us as to how we might live life. But if we just dissect it based on whether or not the facts actually occurred, then we miss the actual truth of the story, which I think is really fascinating. So I'm glad you bring up that example because I see that happen a lot. And I'm like, the story is included there for a reason. And I think that we get caught up in other things, but the story may be the most important part of that interaction.
And I have to geek out for a moment, which I feel I'm allowed to do here.
Oh, absolutely.
But Jonah, you have stumbled into one of my what one editor I know calls reader cookies, which means like if you put a skeleton in a story, I'm just automatically going to like it. It's one of my reader cookies. We all have those as a reader. We're like even a bad version of a story that's got a skeleton sitting in the corner is still a good story to someone for whom that's meaningful.
Right.
So in Jonah, you've hit on sort of one of my reader cookies. I think Jonah, as short as it is, such a short little book, is maybe the best written book in the entire Bible. And it involves, to fully appreciate it, involves knowing a little bit about Hebrew, which is all I know about Hebrew, a little bit. But I recommend reading it if you want to look at it yourself, reading it with a commentary or something that helps illuminate the language use. But it is so short, but so dense and so well constructed. Like in the first couple of sentences, the word down is used 8 times. Jonah goes down, 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 down.
Yeah. That's awesome.
And then he comes out of the whale is the first time he comes up, but then also all these sorts of things, like the adjective that is used to describe the whale that usually gets translated as mighty or large or great is the adjective used to describe the city of Nineveh where he's supposed to be going. So it's sort of this idea that either way you're going to get swallowed by something mighty, but which one will you choose? But one of the things I love the most about it is that it ends with a question. There is no conclusion as we normally think about them. Right. The last sentence of the book is God asking Jonah a question, and then book's over. And what I think is so brilliant about that from a writing standpoint is that no human brain will read a question and not have an answer. Yeah. Like no one just reads that and then they just blankly move on. Everyone before they even know it, there's an instinctual attempt to answer the question. Right. And it involves you. And so it's just a beautifully written book. One of my pipe dreams is one day I would like to do a sort of an English translation and layout and printing of it that highlights everything that's going on in the Hebrew, because so much gets lost in English. Because Hebrew is a cloud of meanings language, which means the same word can have 3 different meanings. Right. And often it is being used because it has those 3 different meanings. But in English, we have to pick one to translate it.
Right.
So there's a lot of problem solving. And how do you put that into English and convey that richness of language? But so anyway, reader cookie. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think so I think the point is too, the point in us saying that is, where are we going to find things that guide us toward deeper semblances of hope, right? we've already talked about movies that will do that for us. We talked about books that will do that for us. There is also something to be said for the deep meaning of whether you think that they literally happened or not, but the stories that are told in books of wisdom. And you and I both agree that that's one of the great ones. But there are so many others. You brought up the good. I mean, you can go through and take something like the Bible and just go through and see all of the stories of wisdom that occur. And if you're willing to use your imagination and ask the question, what is this story prompting me to think about and engage with and feel and take with me, you will find amazing amounts of, I think you'll find mostly hope, honestly. You'll either find one of two things. You'll find either hope or you'll find despair. And even the despair will be pointing you to a problem that you need to deal with so that you have more hope. And I think that that's just amazing. So just a couple quick things before I go to the last question, because I thought that I was going to tack on to what you said and say that hope does something for us. And why do we engage with stories that where we want to engage and have hope as an audience? One, hope gives us a vision, because without hope, we can't even really see a vision. If we have a misplaced sense of vision, we might have a bad vision. It's like despair, but it can give us a vision. It can provide us a way out. It can provide incentive for us to do something. It breeds positivity. I love your it's not, hope is not, you said hope is not positivity, right? Was that the word?
It's not optimism.
Optimism.
Yeah.
Perfect. It's not optimism, but it can start to breed those things, because it can say, yeah, this is bad now, but what can we look for? It can take us to a better direction. Mm-hmm. It encourages action, because we hopefully, so we've used the Bible several times, right? And this is what I think is really fascinating about the Bible, is that if you were to stop reading the Bible and say, okay, then really what the Bible is about is like this thing I need to invest in so that I can get into heaven, you miss the part about the kingdom of God being here on earth as well, and bringing the kingdom of God here on earth. Or whether you're a secular humanist and you just want to bring good things to this earth, hope is going to encourage action, because you can't just wait for the next thing to happen. You have to do something to bring it about. And I think that that's really cool. And then also it can unite us. And I think of all of those things, if you tie a nice little bow around them, hope provides purpose. Hope can ultimately provide purpose. And that's why it's so fun to invest in stories that encourage us to think and to hope. I also think that you and I both agree we need the stories that are tragedies so that we can go, wait a minute, I need my hope to be in something greater than this. Because the tragedy of oftentimes the tragedy of everyday human life is such that I want to hope in something else, right? So I think that that's really important too. But go ahead.
It goes right back to what we were talking about last week. We were talking about how stories are rehearsals. Neurologically, our brain treats stories as rehearsals where we're learning something. And that ultimately, I think behind all of that is all the attempts to consume stories or tell ourselves stories in daydreams or what have you, is to find a way to lead a better life, to have a better life. But that word better is a hope term.
Yeah.
Without the concept of hope and lament, without the idea that something is not as good as it could be right now, but it could be better. Yeah. So hope is built into just sort of the nature of story, the nature of humanity, how our brains work.
Right. Exactly. And let me just check in with you real quick, because I didn't check beforehand. Do you have a hard stop at 3?
Ish.
Okay.
I've got some flexibility.
Okay, so we're not gonna go very far past 3. But what I'm gonna give people an opportunity to do is I'm gonna ask Caleb this last question. We're gonna talk about it. If you have other questions for us, go ahead and put those in the comments now, so that we're not trying to scramble at the end to answer those. And if Caleb has to bounce, then I'll stick around for a little bit and answer some of those questions too, to the best of my ability. Obviously, Caleb's better read than I am. So how can writers
differently read?
There you go. That's fair. How can writers work hope into their story? So we've talked about how important hope is to storytelling, how important lament is, how important despair is, but specifically, how can writers work hope into their stories? Well,
I'll give you the answer of a muse. And but then also talk about it from a more mechanical standpoint, because everyone tells stories differently. But
Sure.
For the intuitive storytellers, the pantsers, the muses, whatever term you use for that, I think all you do is you just tell stories about humans. Because I think as I've tried to circle in that hope is an intrinsic part of being human, being able to imagine otherwise and imagine better, and acknowledge things not being right, acknowledge that there are problems to therefore try to solve, which is what a story is, solving a problem. And so for the more intuitive storytellers, I would say just tell human stories, and you can't escape it. You won't not have hope in it. And even if you write a perfectly despairing story, your audience will still have hopes of their own. They will still be hopeful, desiring, dreaming, imagining creatures that are consuming your story. And so they will still interact with it by the way it violates or plays with their hopes. So on that side, just tell human stories, and you can't escape it. There's but on a mechanical side, I think there's two things that we can do. And I think this is probably the point for me to bring La La Land back up for you.
Oh, yeah.
But you can essentially try to fulfill your audience's hopes and have things end up better. Which, Tolkien says the highest form of that is a fairy tale, whether there are fantastic events or not. Yeah. Or you can intentionally violate hopes. You can build hopes and violate them. And the highest form of drama is tragedy.
Yes.
Also quoting Tolkien on that. So you have two ways that you can be very intentional. You can say, okay, I'm setting these hopes I'm setting up. I'm going to fulfill them, or I'm going to violate them. And I will, and sometimes you will fulfill some of the hopes and violate some of the others. But so the one thing I would do is I would give your work a pass when you're done reading it. Because I think this plays more after the storytelling process than in, because like I said, I think it comes out intrinsically in any storytelling process. But afterwards, go read your script or book or story or whatever it is that you're writing. And every time you see yourself setting up a hope for your characters or for your audience, just take a note of it. And then just decide, do I want that fulfilled or violated by the end of the story? And did I remember to do one of those to it? Right. And then I think you will have a story that is well constructed on the principles of hope and the ways that it doesn't get fulfilled as well as the ways it gets fulfilled.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's great. I love that. And it is exactly a great segue into the La La Land example, because I heard a lot of people after they saw La La Land say, oh, I didn't like that movie at all. And I think it was because they were expecting a traditional romance, which we talked about a little bit earlier. And they didn't get that, right? They didn't get the traditional ending of a traditional romance. And I'm not going to spoil it, but what I will tell you is that if there's any two things that I enjoy, it is stories that end with questions, like your example of Jonah, and it is stories that end in what I would call hopeful tragedy. So the characters at the end of La La Land do not get what they initially hoped for in one aspect, but they do get what they initially hoped for in a different aspect, and they find themselves at peace at the end of the story, even though the relational hope that we had maybe was tragic, right? So I love those kinds of things. One of my favorite Star Wars movies is Rogue One, because of the fact that it ends with hope, but essentially is a tragedy because everybody's laid waste. And so that to me speaks to me personally. I'll throw a couple more on what you were saying. Oh, go ahead. If you want to do a follow-up, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I loved La La Land for that same reason. The people that I saw it with did not like it for that very reason, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way that it ended. But I loved it because it was not a despairing ending. Both the characters had reached a point where I would say that their lives were good, but it was just not it's not the version that they had been hoping for when they were young, which therefore we had been hoping for as an audience. But even that, I think it teaches us different ways to hope.
Exactly.
Teaches us about staying open to a different hope than that you don't have to pin all your dreams on a single imagining otherwise.
Yeah.
Just remember to imagine otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good. I love that kind of stuff. Just a really quick shout out to the Double Speak Studios. Here is actually the Dads That Drink podcast. They received the package I sent them. I sent them like a merch package because they had my favorite interview that I've ever done for my book was on that podcast. And so I'm glad you guys got it and super appreciative of you guys. So my last comments, then we'll close it out. I want you to let people know where they can find you and stuff. But just a couple of quick ways that writers can work hope into their stories. Giving characters desires, needs, and wants. We talked about that in the last show. So if you didn't watch the last show, go check that out there. But ultimately, you will be dealing with their hopes or crushing their hopes or having them fight out of despair or whatever it is. Giving characters a vision for what the future would look like is a way to play with hope. Putting the villain's hope up against the hero's hope, I think is a really good way of dealing with hope in different ways because you add so much conflict in that regard. I think that if you make the audience consider, this is one of my favorite portions of hope, is encouraging the audience to consider what lies either beyond the present or beyond the physical. And I think this is what resonates with so many Star Wars fans, is because when you see a movie like Rogue One, you have to think beyond the physical of these people sacrificed something. What were they sacrificing for? If you don't go straight to hope, then that's just a story that ends in a tragic despair. But we know that other characters' lives are moving forward. We know that the Force is working on the universe to bring about eucatastrophe in this case, just with the Force instead of with a god-like figure. And I think that those kinds of things can be really fun to play with because they can cause human beings to think beyond, right? And I think that the audience will start to think beyond because you've encouraged them to do so. And so the last thing I have on here was another key thing to do was not giving the characters exactly what they were hoping for. And that's sort of the fundamental principle of storytelling, is to not exactly give the audience exactly what they're looking for in all cases. A lot of times that might result in fan service, for example. And I'm sure that AI in the future will be able to write those stories really, really well. But so there you go. I think I love what you said, and those are just some things that we can tack on top of that to deal with things.
Well, and while we're doing practical things, I'd love to bring up something that I think is especially something that writers go through. It's not unique to writers, but it's something that the way that our brains are formed, it is a way that they can trick us or hurt us. And that is that we are good at telling stories. That's why we're writers. We're passionate about telling stories. That's why we're writers. But what we can accidentally do is tell ourselves the story of how our future is going to go, or how our career is going to go, or how this thing I am writing will be received, and by who. And we have to be really careful because that's a shadow side of storytelling, because those are very narrow focuses. We think I'm going to do this, and then this will happen. Someone will react this way, and we'll tell ourselves a very clean story, and it's full of our hopes for ourselves and for our writing. But we need to remember two things: that hope is often lateral, and that hope evolves. So the things that I want out of my career now versus the things I wanted out of my career when it started in 2007 are very different. But if I only allowed myself to stick to that first hope, that first vision, that story I told myself, then I would be in a place of desperation right now, because just the way life and reality goes. For one thing, I was much younger and more naive, and I had a pretty poor picturing of what a good outcome was. I didn't even know what a good outcome to a writing. How would I know what a good outcome to a writing career was? I just started one. You know what I mean? Like I walked in the door and I was telling everyone how it was going to end. And so hope evolves as you mature, as you gain more wisdom, as you gain more experience. Make sure that you update your hopes accordingly. But then also remember that hope is lateral, meaning the thing that you hope for is often met, but often not in the way that you pictured, not in the specific way that you pictured. Yeah. So update your hopes and hold them openly, hold them loosely. So there's room for all sorts of new. So there's room for eucatastrophes, for good things that happen by chance that you could have never or would have never planned. Right. And my career has become mostly that. Like I think of it as being faithful between. We can't create opportunities for ourselves. And as much as you want, you can't make someone else offer you an opportunity, or to have it just materialize. And you cannot create a result of your work. You cannot make anyone like it or want to buy it, or not like it and not want to buy it. Like you have no control over the result of your work or the opportunities that come to you. But what you can do is take those opportunities, be as faithful as possible with them, and then send them back out into the world and let the result take care of itself. And then just get back to being faithful and define that as what it means to be a successful writer. Yeah. So I'm just going to throw that out there because as writers, we have a particular penchant for writing our futures and writing the happy ending that we want. But the happy ending that you want when you start a career versus the happy ending that you want when you're 15 or 20 years into it are going to be very, very different. So don't hold yourselves hostage to an old happy ending. Allow yourself to evolve, to find lateral hopes, allow eucatastrophes to break in and change the directions of your career. And just throughout all of that, just keep writing.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. So where can people find you and find ways to just be aware of what you're up to?
The easiest is my website, calebmonroe.com. The quickest, I guess, the first place I talk about anything is in my newsletter. And if you go to the contact page on calebmonroe.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. It's called The Writer in Its Natural Habitat.
Nice.
And then I will also just say that the live exclusive that I gave 2 weeks ago, that the film that I co-wrote, this Mongolian action film,
I was going to ask you about that.
Was going to come out and streaming the next week, has happened. So it came out last week. The Mongolian Connection, which I co-wrote with the director Drew Thomas, and you can rent it on Amazon, on Google Play. It's supposed to be on iTunes. I just haven't pulled up iTunes to check. You can also order on Blu-ray and DVD. So I'll just throw that out there. If you want to interact with some recent work, that's a great way to do it. But then also, if you just want to sort of learn more about me, things I've done in the past or things I might be doing soon, website and newsletter.
Awesome. Did you send out a newsletter too, by the way?
I did. Finally,
nice.
I sent it like 3 days ago. So like the first, or actually I realized it's because the second week of January I did send a newsletter. So it was my second newsletter of the year.
Oh, cool. First pandemic newsletter.
For those of you who hesitate about signing up for newsletters because you don't want your inbox to be bombarded, just know we're in August next year. So it will not get bombarded.
And the Mongolian Connection, I got to go watch that. I want to watch that. If I can, I'm going to watch that this weekend, and maybe we can even talk a little bit about that next time we do a show. If
you feel like journeying to Los Angeles, you could come up and watch it with us because we're going to do a screening at some point.
Oh, that would be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to do that. That'd be really, really cool. Well, that is it for today's show. Special thanks to Caleb Monroe for joining me today, and definitely go watch his movie. Go watch the Mongolian Connection because I'm sure it's awesome. If you like this conversation, by the way, hit the like button for me, depending on where you're at. If you're on Facebook or even if you're on YouTube, you can hit the like button for us. If you've got a comment or a question about hope, leave it in the comments below, and I'll get back to it some other time this week as soon as I can. Caleb and I will be back in 2 weeks to do another live show. We'll either be talking about his movie or despair or some other topic related specifically to storytelling. If there's a storytelling or writing topic you'd like for us to cover, just let me know. You can either shoot me a message on social or you can leave it in the comments and we can get to that specifically. If you guys
suggest some things. That's always fun.
I would love suggestions. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next episode. Keep writing. Keep grinding, and Caleb and I will see you on the next video. Bye.